Alrighty, and we're on.
All right.
So I'm here with Paul Vallejo. And so Paul and I briefly met at one of an event, obviously for a United Australia Party members event.
Yep.
And Paul actually presented to our candidates group. It would have been maybe last Thursday or the Thursday before, and did a bit of a presentation based on his experience and his background. So perhaps let's just do a little bit of an overview of your background. So you grew up in
New York.
In New York.
Yes.
Okay. And so you've obviously done quite a bit of study, and you were an engineer for NASA.
Yes. My first career out of uni was working for Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Yep.
Worked there for about 10 years. But I got 2 other science degrees after that.
Okay.
One in economics and one in sociology, actually.
Yep.
So it's been a wandering road. But yes, the first 10 years was at Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Yep. All right. And so, we're gonna slow it down and go back through a whole bunch of different things. But just literally before we kicked off this podcast, I actually commented on Paul's shirt when he first came in. I said, "Oh, that's a very bright shirt," and he said, "Look, that's my protest shirt."
Yeah.
And then we started having a bit more of a conversation, and I was explaining, part of the reasons why, I started this whole podcast journey was because of my friend Adrian, who committed suicide 3 years ago. And I was explaining to him how, it was very impactful to my life just because, we obviously were good mates growing up. And then, my friend Ivan and myself were probably the last guys to see him. I've got the last ever photo of him, and it was him carrying my son. And then 5 days later, he was gone. And, as a result of that, you do a lot of thinking. And I was looking at my own kids and starting to really think about, when is it that we're truly gone? And, what I was saying to Paul was that, when you're not gone when you pass away, you're gone when you're forgotten. And then Paul started on a bit of a story, and I said, look, can we pause there, because I just wanted to see if you were okay to share it. You mentioned your brother, so
yeah. So hopefully I'll be able to get through this without some long pauses. But yeah, that was the reason why I ended up leaving NASA, is because in 1997, my brother died in a midair collision off the coast of Namibia.
And, yep. What was he flying?
A C-141.
So what style of craft is that?
It was I think it's called a Starlifter.
Okay.
He was delivering demining equipment to the Namibian and Army trainers, because there was a lot of mines along the Namibian-Angolan border from a war before that. And so he dropped off a group of special forces and demining equipment and was returning back home. And there was, because the Angolan air traffic control wouldn't speak to Americans, they had the information to know that the German plane coming in didn't change altitude as they should have. And so in over the ocean, there are highways in the sky. And if you're going from 0 to 180 or 181 to 360, you're supposed to be at different altitudes separated by 4,000 feet. And as the German plane made the turn, they should have changed altitude according to those kind of international aviation rules, and they didn't. And, in the huge sky that there was, they found a way to hit each other.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about what you went through, there's something different about sudden death, when you don't have, and something that's not in the natural order of things. And it's not something I don't think anyone can explain until they've experienced it. Yeah. That shock.
Yeah.
And so, and that ended up changing a lot of things in my life, actually, one of which, when you talk about kids, I always wanted to be an uncle and not necessarily a father, because I was, a little bit of a heavy wanderlust. And then when Pete passed away, it became very important to me to have a
kids.
Family. Yeah, it was like a bolt out of the blue.
Yep.
So
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you mentioned so Pete was fond of wearing very bright shirts.
Yeah, I was always more the introvert.
Yep.
A bit of a nerd, and I did like getting out and exploring, but I was not nearly as comfortable with people as he was.
Yep.
And so,
was he older or younger?
Older, 5 years.
5 years, okay.
Yeah. He was a bit of a parent to me in some ways too.
Yep.
So when I went out to the protests, I wanted to, wear something that was sort of like, everyone's out of their comfort zone. It's one of the first things that I wanted to say to you is thank you, because my sense of the people who are stepping up at this time, this is not what they wanted necessarily to do. A lot of people are out of the side of their comfort zone, pushed outside of their comfort zone. And, some people are stepping up and stepping forward and getting out. I was never much of a protest person. You've stepped up, and I'm grateful to everyone who has. And, when I have gone to the protests, I've spent a fair bit of time just going around saying thank you.
Yep.
And so anyway, that's kind of more Pete than it is me.
Yep.
And the shirt is more Pete than it is me.
Yep.
And so I felt like I would wear it today.
Oh, that's nice.
I didn't plan on talking about that, but
I've got a knack for extracting out, lots of little things.
So far, so good.
That people don't like to talk about. Usually my first question I ask people before I switch in on any recording, is there anything you don't want to talk about? Because, rather than it being awkward when we get there, I just sort of will avoid, that particular topic, right? So, okay, let's now go back a little bit and talk about, your childhood and where you grew up. So you grew up in New York.
Yeah. I grew up in Westchester, which is a county north of the city.
Yep.
I went to high school in Manhattan. To my shame, the same high school Fauci went to.
Okay.
He graduated much earlier than I did. That's a whole can of worms right there.
Yep.
And then I went from there to University of Virginia.
Yep.
Studied nuclear engineering in my first major, and then transferred to a kind of a more broad engineering science co-op at the Johnson Space Center twice. Once in the weightless environment training facility. Yep. And the other one was in systems engineering.
Okay. Let's pull up there because I got plenty of questions on that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, first one, obviously, let's talk about the weightless training. So did you get to experience the whole weightless training thing?
Yeah, so you can't really simulate zero gravity on Earth. So one of the ways in which you want to train your astronauts is, well, how are you going to handle zero gravity? Because there's no such thing as down. Yep. Right. And so there are only really two ways to do that. One is create a neutrally buoyant environment where all the tools, the metal tools, would be, have a little bit of floaty material on them so that they would act weightless. And you'd have
underwater.
Underwater. So that you'd have Velcro in the same places that you would have at the time, the space shuttle. And so you'd put the tool, because here you put a tool on the table, it's going to stay on the table. Yep. You need to practice not thinking that way. You need to practice where, you can have a work surface facing up, down. There is no up and down. Yep. And so, the weightless environment training facility is to train astronauts for the zero-G environment. The other one is the
vomit comet.
The vomit comet. Yeah, you know about that one. Yeah. Yep. Where you can get, I forget what it is, 90 seconds of zero-G to practice certain things.
Yep. Did you get to experience the vomit comet?
I did not. I volunteered to be a test subject. Yep. And I went through some of the training, but I never flew.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And so let me also then just pull it back a little bit. So when you were growing up, did you have any idea what you wanted to be?
No. I was a big Trekkie. Yep. And that's one of the things that kind of ended up bringing me to where I was. Yep. In high school, there was a strategy games group, and the person who kind of ran that group for a while is the person who introduced me to how he interned at the Space Center. Yep. So I basically ended up following his program to end up interning at the Space Center.
Okay. So. All right. And so then as you went through high school, like what sort of a personality, like how would you describe yourself? I know you said you're an introvert, but like I guess what were your interests? What were the things that you're into?
I did like strategy games, so I'd have
like
to
Warhammer or
Starfleet battles, and role playing games. Yep, and things like that. I really and that's how I met some of my best friends that I have still to this day. So I'd get up, I'd catch the 7:16 train into Manhattan, go through Grand Central Station, take the subway out. It took me about an hour to get an hour and 15 each way. And I usually wouldn't get home until about 6. Yeah, because I'd stay after school and play the games. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So then, so when you finished high school, did you? So you're already on a pathway then, or
no? My first majors were psychology, not majors, but the classes I chose were psychology and philosophy.
Psychology and philosophy.
And because I really liked the idea, like trying to figure out why people make. Studying people's minds. That's I thought a really interesting topic. And philosophy, I was also interested in, and I was really disappointed in those classes.
Okay.
The philosophy class I took ended up being. I took a class called Theory of Games and Decisions, which I thought sounded awesome.
Yep.
And turned out to be set theory. Like if A is better than B, and B is better than C, A is better than C, and I was. Yeah, and psychology was also disappointing.
So what was disappointing about psychology?
It was memorization. Instead, like, I think you're probably a practical psychologist in some ways. I mean, you seem very intuitive and in tune with people. But it was memorized the 7 stages of Piaget's, or Freud's this, and it wasn't insightful. It was memorization, and it was. Some conception of some, it wasn't insightful at all.
Yeah, fair enough. I always find like, so if you can actually hear some background noise, that is my baby crying in the background as she's trying to go to a nap.
Understand.
So when it comes to the whole psychology thing, I always find this really interesting because I view forms of education as different lenses that you can then use to interpret the world, right? Because to go and say that there is only one objective truth in the world, to try and identify what that objective truth would be, is like the question of life, right? Like I think, everybody wants to answer this question, but everybody only has really inferences or observations. No one really knows what that answer is, right? Yep. Unless you are, God or some sort of, higher being, it'd probably be almost impossible to understand what is the objective truth in life. Right.
And that's a huge issue these days because we live in a narrative-driven and a propaganda world.
Yep.
There are a lot of people who think they understand the truth watching a news organization that in any objective sense is clearly compromised to only put forward a certain narrative.
Yep.
So scientifically, the same thing. Go ahead.
Yeah. So when we say, so let's talk about narratives. I guess we might as well digress and talk about it at this point in the conversation. So I remember when I was in primary school, and it would have been either year 5 or year 6, and at the time, in Australia, they would show us a documentary or a Four Corners media piece, and essentially the point of the exercise was to understand that there is spin, some form of a narrative that is on this particular documentary piece or whatever you want to call it, on that particular segment. And the idea was that, our teachers would challenge us to try and understand, is this what is the narrative behind this?
Good.
Right? I feel like I don't know whether that happens in the schooling system today.
Doesn't seem like it.
Okay, so you got a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old boy, so they probably haven't had any exposure to that kind of.
My sense of things is schools used to teach you how to think, and now they teach you what to think. It's gone from critical thinking to orthodoxy.
Yep.
And it's not the right direction.
Yep.
And a lot of people think the news that they watch is the news, and everyone else, is in some kind of a propaganda hole. And truth is that everyone's news channel is one side of a narrative.
Of course.
But a lot of people don't realize that they are consuming propaganda as well.
Well, I think that comes down to, we have this thing in society where people are looking for the silver bullet, this panacea that is going to give us the easy answer to all of our problems. And, you can see it in the way that how marketing material has been derived over the years. So when it comes to health and fitness marketing, it is, it's always talking about this diet or that diet or this particular exercise protocol or that particular exercise protocol, right? So it's very fad-based and gimmicky.
Yes,
right?
Definitely.
Because that's what gets people on the train. You go and look, if your lifestyle wasn't generating you the right results and you were obese and things like that, and then you started to do anything, chances are you're going to have a positive result.
Yeah.
Right? But then what happens is then we go, oh yeah, that program was really, really good. It worked for me. And then you try and proselytize it or evangelize it to everybody else because it's helped you. Now, what has helped a particular individual, it may not help or benefit another individual. Like, somebody on a vegan diet probably wouldn't help me as much, if I was to change to a plant-based diet, depending on what my goals were.
Yeah.
Right. But we get into this loop because, we feel like it's helped us so much that we have to go and share that with everybody else. And we want everybody else to see the benefits of this. Right. And I feel like and this is going out on a little bit of a limb, right? When you take away some of those elements which were previously faith-based, right? So people used to have, religion, and whatever religion you have, that was your thing that you would, use for that process of evangelizing and doing that sort of thing. So you'd be less likely to then form these community groups based around secular activity, right? Yep. But when you take the religion out of it, people need to find community.
Yeah, I think that's a big topic. There's a phrase that says, if you don't believe in something, you'll fall for anything.
Yes.
And what we've come to find, I think, is as people have moved in a secular direction, they've gone from a particular religion to a secular religion, not realizing that it's a religion.
Yep.
Even in my view, a lot of the green energy, the environmentalist movement, there are, and I love nature. I've been to almost all the national parks in the United States.
Yep.
My happy place is not somewhere social with lots of people. It's paddling on a lake.
Yep.
So I'm a real nature lover. But the environmentalist movement, in a lot of ways, it's a one-sided narrative where people just believe something without really questioning it.
Yep.
And so you have various forms of secular. Also, the purity, virtue signaling, and showing your purity to, the woke religion, for instance.
Yep.
That's the modern religion of our times, and it's with the equivalent of book burning and metaphorical burning people at the stake for
cancel
sacrilege.
culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's really it's religion in its zeal and lack of questioning. And if there's a positive faith can be very positive for a lot of people, and it's a huge part of the modern secular religions are really worrying to me.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that the more involved that things become, when I say more involved, so as an example, life can be quite complicated. It can also be quite simple, right? So there's two ways that I can approach life. I can either approach life from the perspective of I need to achieve X, Y, and Z and achieve all of these goals to be happy, all right, and make all this money and be wealthy and be rich and all this, to try and keep up with the Joneses and keep my lifestyle going the way that I want it to go. Or alternatively, I can, sort of take a step back from the world and say, I'm the wealthiest person in the world because I don't need anything.
Well, that's one of the things. I have one cousin who I like to call the richest man I know.
Yep.
Because he's got a positive perspective. Like, he doesn't have more than a lot of my friends who work really hard, but he's got a positive perspective on everything. And there was a book, it was called Happiness. I think it was written by someone in Harvard, and he said happiness is the ultimate currency. And it's true that I know plenty of very well-off people who are miserable, and the things that we can give our life meaning to, if we feel like we're making progress, that gives us happiness much more than a particular destination. And so, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I got that from my own personal experience. I achieved this goal that I've been working towards in my career, and I achieved it 4 years earlier than I anticipated to achieve it. And when I got there, I realized, hey, this didn't change my life one iota. Like nothing. I was still the same person. And so that's what made me then start to do a lot of thinking in terms of, okay, this whole thing about, I think the beautiful thing about goals is that it can push you to places that you never thought you could achieve.
True.
And I think that's actually, a step in the journey. And then once you've gotten to achieving some of those big goals that you've had in your life, then you start to think about, okay, happiness isn't about achieving goals. Happiness actually comes from within. Like there's no external factor that can make me happy for any extended period of time other than my own happiness within myself. And, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is like, a lot of people when we're growing up, we might have siblings, we always have our parents around, we have our friend network as we get older. And so then what happens is that we hardly spend any of our time just with ourselves, right? And, sometimes when people do that, they actually realize, shit, I don't really like this person that I'm hanging around with, and it's me, right? And so until you actually work on that and you can be comfortable in your own skin, how can you then, help or develop or be a great partner or friend to other people, right?
Yeah, it's life doesn't come with an instruction book, and neither does parenting.
No, definitely not. Definitely not.
You know, you'd like to think it does, and it's and there are a lot of things that there isn't one right answer. You know, what my kids really like Minecraft.
Yep.
You know, and you know, what's the point? How do you win? You know, you build.
Yeah.
You know, life is not. Yeah, it doesn't have a particular end in mind.
Yeah.
But we find our ways to make a difference and progress and help others, and that's, I think, you know, what gives us the highest satisfaction.
Absolutely. All right. So let's talk a little bit about. You studied psychology, philosophy,
And then I changed to engineering.
and then you changed to engineering.
Yeah.
So okay, then that was after being obviously a bit demoralized by what you.
Yes. And then running into that friend of mine who said, "Oh, you know, I'm co-oping at the Johnson Space Center," and you know, we had a Star Trek in common.
Yep.
And I was like, "Ooh, that sounds really interesting. What do you guys, you know, what do you do? Oh, how do I do that?" And basically, he said, you know, go to a school with a good engineering program, get good grades, write this person.
Yep.
And that's what I did.
Okay. So where did you go for your engineering?
University of Virginia.
Virginia. Okay. And so did you have a particular major where you like doing?
Yeah, I started off the nuclear engineering.
Yep.
But that was just kind of to enter the engineering school.
Okay.
And after that, you had more latitude to change. And I changed to basically a pan engineering major,
Okay.
where I could kind of pick my classes a little bit.
Yep.
A bit of nuclear, a bit of, I did my lab in astronomy because I had a telescope at the top of Observatory Hill,
Nice.
same place where the nuclear reactor was.
Yep.
And then some aerospace engineering.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. So, and what one of the things I'm curious about, you know, because I always found with my tertiary education at university, it was one of those things that, you know, could I have gotten to where I am in life without it? There's probably a chance, right? But what I found was that, you know, what it gave me was, and this is something that my actual engineering teacher at high school said to us, to our class. His name was Mr. O'Brien. So, and he said to us, you know, guys, when you go to university, what you actually get out of your bachelor's degree is the ability to learn for yourself, right? Don't think that that piece of paper is going to have taught you anything other than how to find information for yourself, right? So, you know, for you, in terms of translating some of the things that you learned in university across to when you started, you know, your graduate, I'm guessing you went into a graduate program at NASA, was it?
So when I was working, I basically took classes at night to work on my sociology degree, and it was partly just to kind of expand into a different direction. One of the things I have a very high curiosity, and so I wanted to learn in a bit of a different direction. And it was when I was almost done with that degree where Pete passed away. And so, you know, it's one of those moments where, you know, life is short, and I was doing a teaching internship, which I really loved. And I thought what I wanted to do was teach. But it was a wandering road after that. And,
Okay. Can we talk a bit about your time at NASA?
Sure.
Yep. Okay. So what was that experience for you like? You know, what was it like the first day that you walked into the place?
That actually is a funny story. So yeah, the first day, my brother started pilot's officer candidate school right around the same time I started my first NASA internship.
Yep.
So he actually dropped me off at the front, and you get your badge, and you know, you go to your first. And I actually was first assigned to power and propulsion, the pyrotechnics lab, which I thought was really ideal because I like blowing things up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, you know, I went to the lab, and it turned out really. It was very. They were testing the pyrotechnics that separated the solid rocket boosters from the fuel tank.
Yep.
And they needed to make sure, you know, test it over and over again to check the reliability. Needs to be done. You know, 100% important. But I was more interested in sort of a broader picture than kind of taking apart pressure vessels day after day, where they would run these tests. And so I asked to see if I could experience a different part of it, and that's where I ended up at the weightless environment training facility,
Okay.
which was more interesting to me.
Yep.
So yeah, the first day, Peter dropped me off, and he drove to San Antonio for officer candidate school, and I found an apartment. Yeah.
Okay. And then from a culture perspective, so what was the organization like?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great parts about working there, was a fascinating environment. I mean, the history of the space program, it was a great environment to work in. Right at the front of the gate was one of the Saturn V rockets that they didn't end up launching. There was like four. The Apollo program had something, I'm going to get this wrong, like 5 moon landings, but they were supposed to go another, say, 4 times, and the leftover rockets were
still there.
Yeah, they were. So in the beginning, anytime you have a bureaucracy, in the beginning it was very risk taking. Like anytime the astronauts flew, they knew that there was a serious chance something would go wrong. And over time, a lot of times, bureaucracy gets more and more risk averse. And so after the moon landing program, which was a phenomenal achievement, of course, NASA was looking for what to do next. And then we went to the space shuttle program. It's one of those things, when I started there, the government really didn't know what they wanted to do. And that was one of the reasons I ended up leaving, is because, they had an idea of, should we go to Mars? But Congress didn't want to fund it. Or should we do this? But, so we'd kind of start a lot of programs and stop them, and start and stop. And Space Station was supposed to, the International Space Station was a third version. Originally, it was Space Station Freedom, which they started, and a lot of things about it didn't work, and they scrapped it, and they went to something else. So there was a lot of starting and stopping, and projects that you would work on but wouldn't go anywhere.
I find that when you bring up bureaucracy, right? I've been thinking a lot about leadership, and obviously I was a business leader before. I was running a dealership, and I had a lot of staff, and so I always used to think about, what is my style of leadership, and I guess what influences how I want to be a leader to other people, right? And it was one of those things where, I think being an effective leader, you need to have obviously clarity of vision, right? Because if you don't have a clear direction in terms of where you want to go, how is anybody else going to know where you want to go, right? So clarity of vision would probably be, the first thing. And then the second thing after having clarity of vision is actually, formulating some kind of a plan to achieve that vision, right? Because it's great to have a pie in the sky vision, but without actually dictating what are those steps to achieve that intended consequence that you want, you're not really going to go anywhere. But then the third thing that I think is really important for any leader is to take the time to consider what are the second, third, or fourth order consequences, or the unintended consequences of how you want to get there. Because I think a lot of the times when it comes to actual implementation, we take steps on a journey. So, you talk about, the first 2 iterations of the space station that didn't happen. We can talk about it with the Australian government and nuclear submarines, right? That we get ourselves into a position where we go, we made a mistake, but it's a costly mistake because you've already invested money into that particular exercise to have to wind it back. So it's the old adage of measure twice, cut once, right? Because once you cut the leg too short, the stool is going to be either off or really squat, And I feel like a lot of times when it comes to an organization that's developing, and the analogy that I use for this when I talk about it in business, and I think it would apply to government as well, I think it applies to a lot of things in life, is that there are 3 sort of layers to any sort of company, right? So there is the leadership layer, which would be like the owner. There'd be the management layer, so if there's a manager or general manager that's running that particular business or ministry or whatever. And then there's the employee level, and the employee level is obviously the person that's responsible for doing the day-to-day tasks. And quite often the analogy I use would be like, okay, let's say that I'm Johnny the plumber, and I start my plumbing business. At that particular point in time, I am the employee, I am the manager, and I am the leader. Right. I encompass all three of those roles. And then what happens is, my business, Johnny's Plumbing, suddenly gets a little bit successful. And I realize that, hey, I've got more work than I can handle.
Yep.
So, Paul, went to plumbing school with me. So I'm going to give Paul a job. And Paul's also going to become an employee of Johnny's Plumbing. And now there's 2 employees, yourself and myself, but I'm still the owner and the manager trying to grow this business further. And the business does really well. And suddenly, we're in this position where I've hired, 10 plumbers to do the work. And I've realized that, hey, I don't have time to do the work anymore. So I take myself out of the employee space and I move more into the management and ownership space. And then, the business keeps growing. And then we realize that, you know what? We've now got 20 plumbers working for us. And I go to Paul and I say, Paul, I need you to be my manager because it's too much for me to handle now. I'll work on the leadership and the direction and the marketing of the business, and you can look after the day-to-day job allocation, management of the contractors and things like that. So the business starts to grow and get bigger and bigger, and these layers start to formulate and appear. And
those are very different skills. The initial skills you had to be a master plumber or running a small team.
Yep.
Very different than the strategy side. And one of the hardest parts is knowing when to fire yourself.
Yes.
Because at some point you might have so much accounting to do. And you have to be honest with yourself. I'm not good at managing people, or I'm not good at managing this, and that's the hard part. Ray Dalio, who he wrote a great book. Some of the things I like, some of the things I don't. But he talked a bit about being honest with yourself as far as
what is your skill set?
Right, and when to fire yourself from a role that you might think is important, but it's not really for you.
Yep. No, absolutely. And so this is, how we then get to this position where, suddenly we're a publicly listed plumbing company, right? And, I've realized that, hey, my skill set is great to be, a COO, but not great to be a CFO, as an example. Right. And then I go and hire a CFO and I have all these different layers. And, as a result of that, without clarity of vision, because I may have never have started that company with the intention of it to be that size. Right. So once you get a company to that size, the vision obviously will change.
Yep.
Right. But who is now influencing the vision? Is it still the company that I started, or is it still? Has it sort of become a different cultural identity because of all the other influences that you have by management? Because at the end of the day, and so taking this example and applying it to government. An elected minister would obviously, for them to make more money, it means that they need to have a bigger portfolio. So they're chasing a larger portfolio in terms of what they're responsible for. And as a result of this, I think what happens with any organization is that the nature of that organization, even whether it's intended or not, but the end goal of any organization is to grow.
Yeah. So there's one place, a lot of times bureaucracies feed on itself. But let me see if you want me to allow this tack. It would be nice if that was our primary problem.
Yeah.
That problem, is so 1990s.
Yeah.
The problem we have today is I wish it was just about growing bureaucracy. There are places the government has stepped that I never would have thought I would have seen in my lifetime in what we call a free society. Should we go there or should we not go there?
We can go there. Look, I think it's worthwhile to have the discussion. At the end of the day, we're doing a thought exercise.
Right.
So I do hope that there is no censorship here and we don't get removed. But I think if we do the thought exercise, at the end of the day, we are 2 individuals having a conversation. The fact that it'll be public is public. So what? But I feel like, whether, and for people listening, whether you agree or you disagree, that's completely up to you. But I think it's important, just like, when we have debate, right? Sometimes the premise of the debate may mean that you don't agree with the team that you're on, right? So, typically.
Definitely.
So, I remember one of the topics that I always like to bring up is the ends justify the means, right? And there used to be a positive and affirmative and a negative side. And you might agree that, the ends does justify the means. You may not. But you have to be able to argue both sides.
And I 100% agree with you. And it was and that idea is so 1990s.
Yep.
The big problem today is that we don't do that in a lot of cases. Everything is driven by, we pick one, what's picked is one side of a narrative. And if you even try to point out some of the flaws in a study or something like that, you get censored, kicked off, deplatformed. That is such a larger problem than many of the issues we were trying to deal with 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm personally shocked at what level we're operating on today. And then the question is, what is this? What do we do about it? How can we get back to the problem of simply managing a bureaucracy? When what we have now is even the terms of the debate. Like, you have to have a debate in order to you see, that's what is so important about a debate and about the scientific process is you test theories, you test ideas, you give the best of both sides. Instead of one idea, and if you disagree, you're just a bad person and we're going to kick you off. Or what we should do is give the best of both ideas and discuss them and debate them, and that's how we learn. But that's not what we're doing, and it's not what our medical establishment is doing. It's not what our government discussion is doing. It's it's a completely different level of problem.
So, okay, let's unpack that a little bit more, right? So I think, if we consider what is the scientific process or the scientific method, right? Traditionally, it was always you would make a hypothesis, right? So we start with a hypothesis, and then
or observation,
and then a hypothesis, and then that hypothesis we then try and test through experimentation. And then we would report back on the outcomes and then say, okay, is that a feasible hypothesis or not? Right. And then, sometimes from the study or from the observations that we make, we might go and say, oh, okay, it looks like, perhaps the outcomes aren't favorable for this hypothesis, but it might lead us to our next iteration of that of the hypothesis to go and say, okay, this is version 2. When we go and update our idea. So as an example, I guess we can talk about atoms, right?
Okay.
So if, now this is going back to my high school physics days now, so you can probably elaborate more on this, but, we went through this stage of talking about, protons, electrons, neutrons, and then, we started to think that, the electrons, are circulating the atom. And then we went to this idea that, they could be anywhere in particular.
They're not in any particular place at a particular time. And and then how would you test that hypothesis?
That's correct.
So, you'd run an experiment, and some of the, the rabbit hole of quantum physics and how mind-blowing and counterintuitive that's one rabbit hole. But the notions we're dealing with today are basically fundamentally about whether or not we're testing a hypothesis at all. But in a lot of cases, a lot of the testing is just narrative driven. I could launch into one example that's recent that really gets under my skin, which is the testing of early treatment. Is that all right?
Yeah. So, okay, let me just say on this note. So, I don't know which early treatment you're going to talk about, but
okay.
Let me just flag this one that I think is interesting. That I think in Queensland, hydroxychloroquine has now been approved. So the ban on doctors prescribing hydroxychloroquine has been revoked. Right, and so that is, I think, a good example that we can use and.
Okay, yeah. So let's just talk about basic hypothesis testing. Because in early 2020, there was a hypothesis of a doctor that hydroxychloroquine worked because he cited a paper that hydroxychloroquine is a zinc ionophore, which allows the zinc to channel into cells and inhibit viral replication. And his hypothesis was, when I give this early with zinc at the normal dose of 400 milligrams, that I find a reduction in hospitalization. So one of my early clues that something is seriously wrong is when I saw the tests come out that tested that hypothesis. One of which was from the Together trial, and the other one was from the Recovery trial, where, again, if you have a hypothesis, the observation was normal dose early with zinc, and it works, and 400 milligrams. If you're going to test that hypothesis, well, you test that hypothesis. But what they did was 2,400 milligrams on day 1, 800 milligrams a day for the next few days on hospitalized patients without zinc. And
so let's pull up on that. So the issue with that is it's no longer early because
Right, no longer early.
generally for somebody to get hospitalized, it means that they've been symptomatic for say a week or so.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah, and if you're fighting something that's supposed to help in the viral replication phase,
Yep.
you fight it. You dose early. Late, all the virus is already dead. You know, because your body, what you're dealing with is the leftover reaction from fighting the virus. So that is a hypothesis. That means if you do it late, you're no longer testing the hypothesis in that one element, but there are other elements. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So that's why I wanted to sort of break that apart, is because you had a very clear statement in terms of the hypothesis that we should have been testing, right? But then in the trial, it was a different hypothesis that was tested. It was tested for late, so for hospitalized patients, and the protocol was different in terms of the dosing.
Yep, and at a dose fit for a gorilla.
Yep.
So let me give you an example. So if hydroxychloroquine is normal dose is 400 milligrams, and they overdosed in the recovery trial or the Together trial. One of them was 2,000 milligrams on the first day. The other one's 2,400 milligrams on the first day. That's a 6x or a 5x of the normal dose. If you did that with paracetamol, you took the recommended maximum daily allowance of paracetamol, and you gave yourself 5x dose, you would need a liver transplant.
Yep.
And so, they basically took hospitalized patients, overdosed them with hydroxychloroquine, which led to a number of deaths and a number of adverse events. And they said this drug is dangerous and it doesn't work, and it just increases side effects. Now, there are a couple of problems here that make it, one of the things I've asked myself over and over again over the last few years is couple of years, is this negligence or is this malfeasance, right? And because people make mistakes, we've seen it plenty of times. But this is a trial that cost millions of dollars to make, and then the reporting. I mean, the error is so obvious. If you overdose by 6 times, that's not a small error. And if if this is the hypothesis, and testing it would be somewhere around it, they're way over here. And that should have been reported on as, what the hell are you doing testing hospitalized patients with 6x the recommended dose? But that's not how it was reported.
Of course not. Because people want the simple outcome.
I think it's worse than that. You're being kind.
I am being kind because, look, and I agree with you. Like I always say, from a leadership perspective, right? If we think about it from a government perspective, it's either malevolence, it's incompetence, or it's negligence.
Right.
It's one of these 3 things.
Right.
Right. And reality is like, you don't want any of those 3 things in your government.
Definitely.
Because they're not going to get you the right outcomes. Right. At the end of the day, if it's malevolent, then the first order consequence was obviously to do something bad to the population. Right. If it's incompetence, well, chances are the second or third order consequences are going to be something bad for the population. And if it's negligence, it's the same thing. Yeah. Right. So that's and so why I try and be a little bit kinder on it is because I think it's very difficult for people to process that it would be intentional, right? And I know that there's plenty of theories, and I think we should just, if people want to go down that rabbit hole, that's their rabbit hole to go down, because at the end of the day,
we can't see intention.
Yes.
We can see action.
Yes.
And we know that the hypothesis was not tested.
That's correct.
We cannot see motivation.
That's right.
Right? Now, we can hypothesis test motivation.
Yep.
And one of the concerns about that is, okay, well, if it was incompetence, maybe there would be some random nature to how the hypotheses are tested badly, right? It'd be, different this way, different this way.
Yeah.
It would be kind to the hypothesis of hydroxychloroquine this time, and negative the other time.
Yep.
But all the errors are in the same direction.
Yep.
Anything that is off patent is tested in a way that guarantees failure, and the media always doesn't point out the failure in the hypothesis testing. They trumpet the narrative that this off-patent medication doesn't work and causes side effects every time. Whereas if it's on patent, like remdesivir, which was tested and shown not to help for deaths, you're free to go. All right, $3,000 a vial. Tested on 3,000 patients. The first thing that Australia approved for against COVID when it was shown not to help, and it was on patent, and that got a pass.
Yep.
So again, could it be, we can't see motivation?
Yeah.
But the hypothesis tests always have a certain characteristic. So without going farther than that, I'll leave it with you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to pull up, and we'll just move on to the next topic.
Fair enough.
Because it's a very deep, dark rabbit hole.
Yeah, it is.
And I'd like for this to be able to get to as many people as possible, and people to actually listen and make their own
understand
educated observations.
Yeah,
right.
I'll just say because it is a rabbit hole. If you look up the test protocol on hydroxychloroquine, the Together trial and the recovery trial, take a look at their test protocols, look at what the normal dose of hydroxychloroquine is, and if anyone can figure out a good reason for that, let me know.
Yep. Well, it's like so I'll use this example because I think this is a sort of good parallel, right? When somebody is starving, right, and so they've got starvation, or they've haven't eaten for an extended period of time, the first sort of inclination for them would be to obviously stuff themselves, right, and to eat as much food as they possibly can. Now, the outcome of that is likely going to be death, right? If you've been starved for a week or something like that, and then you go and overeat, your body goes into shock, right? So the correct protocol, obviously, to try and address somebody who's had starvation as a condition is to obviously feed them in increments, right?
Yeah.
So
I've heard that. I don't understand the mechanism, but I've heard that.
Yeah. So I think that's then the reason why I use that analogy is because almost everything we consume can either be viewed as a medicine,
yes,
or a drug.
There's no such thing as a poison, only a poisonous dose.
That's correct.
Even water can kill you.
Yes, right. If you drink way too much water, you can die.
Yep.
Right. So and that's why I use that analogy, is because anything that is over and over and above your natural threshold, and for some people that could be something that they might be allergic to. Right. For some people they can't have peanuts. They can't even be in the vicinity of peanuts. Right. So peanuts to them would be a poison.
Yep.
But to another person who without a peanut allergy, it's food.
Yep.
Right? Eggs, like all of these things nowadays that people have common allergies to or can have anaphylaxis from. For those people, it's poison. For other people, it's food. So let's we'll move to the next.
No worries.
Yeah. So okay.
We can stay on the general science topic, or you want to pick the direction?
No, let's go. General science.
So one of the things, hypothesis, and some of the other things that really have been bugging me about science in today's environment is appeals to authority.
Yep.
Right. They say, are you a virologist? Are you an epidemiologist? Oh, well, if you're not, you don't have any say. Right. That's not how science works. I'm very passionate about the process of science. One of the heroes that I'll point to would be Galileo, or Bruno, burned at the stake for telling the truth, a heresy to the clergy at the time. I think it was Feynman who said one good test is more powerful than a legion of academics. If you have the data, if you have a good experiment, and it happens to upend science, that is how science progresses.
Yeah.
But these days we have a whole cadre of people saying, if you don't have the credentials, if you don't have the letters past your name, your opinion is not worth anything. And that is such nonsense. That is such a dark hole, particularly when you have hypothesis testing, like we just said, we just talked about.
Yep.
You don't have to be a scientist to know that is absolute rubbish. And so this happens on a lot of scientific fields. It happens in the climate realm. It happens in the medical realm. And we've got to grow up. These things, the way we're taking science in a direction of faith and appeals to authority and narrative is an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
And I think there's few bigger problems.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I always think about this that without so if you think about language, right, you need to have structure and labels to be able to identify things, so that then you can build upon. It's like foundational knowledge, right? So you have these very basic labels for things. So as an example, a noun, right? So we talk about broad subcategories: a noun, a verb. So we know verbs are words that do things, action words.
Yep.
Right, and a noun is there to describe, or for an object, and then you have an adjective to describe that object or describe that action. And what happens is that, you know, I feel like nowadays we've taken this labeling to an extreme, right? So everything has to have a label and a category and a name, and you know, and I think that comes down to, you know, we as people just seem like we just want processed information. Right? We want to have this thing where things have been processed for us so that we don't have to do any of the hard thinking or the hard reasoning for ourselves because, okay, A, we might be too busy, right?
Everyone's time poor.
Everyone's time poor, right? And like one of the things, and I'm just going to digress for 1 second because I was actually thinking about this the other day, that the single biggest gift that you can give to anybody nowadays is your time. Because it's a finite resource.
Yeah.
All right? If you live once.
It's the only thing you can't get back.
It's the only thing you can't get back. Right. And so I was thinking about that in relation to my kids, you know, that, you know, I want to make sure that, you know, the time that I actually give them, it's not wasted time. It's great quality, you know, bonding time and things like that. Because if I'm going to spend my time, I might as well spend it on something worthwhile. Yep. Right. And, you know, in our household, it's always, you know, we always try, my wife and I, we're always nitpicking at each other, you know, when we're on our phones and not doing the right thing. Right. Because I think that's really, really important. You know, if you think about what is the single greatest gift, it's more than anything else. You know, some people say, oh, the biggest gift you can give somebody is love, right? But, you know, if you actually think about that, what does that mean? I could love my parents if I don't see them in a year.
Right. What is it? Yeah.
Well, you haven't given them any of your time.
Yeah.
Right? So actually, I think the single greatest gift you could give somebody is time. But anyway, back to my analogy about labels, right? So because people are time poor, we look for these labels to then identify, you know, good or bad, right? So, you know, we get to this point where we go, oh, virologist, okay, good. All right, it doesn't matter whether there could be a competing virologist or somebody with who has a different qualification or whatever the case may be. We just look at the title and then we go, okay, yeah, that should be he should be an authority, right? We don't look into then the credentials that exist behind that, right? We might see doctor. Oh, good. Okay, but is it like an actual medical doctor or is it a doctorate in something else?
And are they just parroting what their health regulators have told them to say versus, you know, actually going through a critical thinking process and using their knowledge in order to guide you? You know, these days, I think we have a real danger that, you know, medical doctors are afraid to say anything that hasn't been passed down from them to from the medical regulators, who are also clearly a captured industry. You know, the FDA, the World Health Organization, they are not public institutions that are unbiased. You know, the financial ties to both, you know, the drug companies, right, and you know, the people, the non-government organizations sort of guiding policy, means that the doctors are kind of getting force-fed guidance from organizations that do not have the public interest in mind, in my view, or at least, while I can't read their thoughts, it doesn't make sense from a health point of view, right? That part I'm sure of. Motivation, I can't see, but it doesn't make sense.
So, and part of the reason why I've done a lot of thinking into this concept of labels, right, is because, you know, so I train martial arts, right? And so without any structure, it'd be very difficult to develop any martial arts ability. Right, so you know, a punch is a punch, a kick is a kick, but then we can go into the nuance of technique, right? And we start building these elements of structure around how do we do things, right? And then as you progress through, you know, upper levels of competition, you start to realize that, hey, you know, things that you were taught, you know, sometimes you need to be able to bend the rules.
Yes.
Right. So how you might throw this particular technique or utilize this particular movement can adjust depending on who you're fighting against or who you partnered with, and what is the outcome that you're chasing, right? So what happens is that if you fail to, if you become rigid in your ideology, that this is how I was taught, this is how the move must be done, then at some point that structure actually becomes a cage, right? And because you're actually bound by that cage, you can't operate out from the outside of that to then think about how to problem solve this from a different way. But the alternative is that if you had no structure, you wouldn't be able to grow at all.
I have a smart friend who once said, you have to learn the rules in order then to know how to break the rules. So, you know, once you've built up, well, let's say in tennis, you know, the muscle memory of making good strokes and doing things right, and then once you're expert at that, you can think at the level of strategy. But you can't think strategy until you've had, the strokes.
Yep.
So it sort of has to be this progression. But if all you do is, if you're never thinking about strategy and just, doing a turnkey, repetitive, someone who is thinking strategy is going to clean your clock.
Yep.
So yeah, I get that.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on this idea, right? So I feel like a lot of the way, and this is talking about it from a business perspective, but I know in a lot of businesses, especially in the automotive industry, we're going down this pathway where a lot of business owners wanted to sort of break up the roles to make them more simple, right? And so I'll give you an example. So I guess in a large dealership, the common experience that you may have nowadays is that when you go to buy a car, obviously there'll be a girl there who will meet and greet you at reception and then introduce you to somebody who can probably tell you about the car and show you through the product. Now, in some businesses, so I'll use BMW as an example, there might be like a BMW genius who knows the technology inside and out, talks to you all about the technology, but isn't allowed to sell you the car, right? Yeah. So then you get passed on to the next person who their job is basically to be able to negotiate with you, set up the structure of the deal. And then from there, then you probably get handed off to the next guy who is the finance and insurance or female, or the next girl who's the finance and insurance manager who then tries to organize your finances and insurances. And then you meet, the pre-delivery coordinator or the aftermarket person who then, wants to talk to you about how to prepare your vehicle and paint protection and these sorts of things. And then you get passed on to the delivery coordinator who then, sets the date for when your car's going to arrive and when it's going to be prepared and all these sort of things. And then you may or may not see your sales consultant again at the handover stage, right? Sure. So, a lot of businesses have gone down this pathway of breaking up these roles because in their eyes, it's going to be easier to train somebody to just be able to do
one piece of it,
right? And I don't know whether I'm, just a bit old school in my thinking, but for me, I don't want specialists. I want experts, right? And to me, an expert is somebody that could do that whole process from start to finish. And the reason why I prefer that is because the problem when you break up all these different layers, yes, it might make it easy for you to hire more people or find people because they're doing a lot less. But the quality of the person and the quality of the experience is diminished.
Yeah, true.
Whereas, and that's why a lot of people just want to deal with the boss because they want to deal with somebody
right.
who can take you through the whole process without going through all of these individual steps, right? So, and why I bring that up is that I feel like, using your example of, people with the virologist qualification or whatever qualification, if you think about just that particular qualification, they might be a specialist, but there is a lot of knowledge that exists for people that may not have that particular qualification, but look at it from a different perspective.
Yes. So, in terms of dealing what we've been dealing with, there are a lot of subspecialties that would go into having insight into this. So you have your evolutionary virologists, you have your vaccine experts, you have your epidemiologists, you have your people who treat the cytokine storm, after the intensive care people. You do need a broad perspective, and sometimes, or even your health regulator, if they were acting for people's health, and I'm not at all convinced they are, they are like, okay, well, my focus is health, and your focus is making sure the economy, their concern is one subset of making sure people, I'll give you an example, even if they were actually concerned about health, they would say, well, we can get fewer people to die of the disease if we do this. Okay, great. So, we lock everyone up and no one will die of the disease, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
But we die of other causes.
Exactly, right?
Exactly.
And so, this is one of the things is that there are a lot of times people are just not looking at the trade-offs. And, and instead of being honest about that and saying, well, I'm focused on the diseases from deaths, but that person should be well aware that there are other concerns involved. I mean, families have lost businesses and homes because they've been locked out of their jobs. That has a health cost. Even if, you're tasked with reducing COVID deaths, to press for COVID zero. I mean, for instance, the best way we can all reduce carbon dioxide as far as the climate goes, everyone puts a plastic bag over their head, no carbon emissions, right? Now, I mean, that solves the problem. But it is not looking at all sides of the problem, right? That is not the only goal.
The blinkers are only on one facet of the problem rather than seeing the bigger picture. And I think that ties back into what I was talking about, the unintended consequences, right? We think about, okay, we need to, it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction to go and say, okay, we're going to focus on this particular problem, but by fixing one problem, you've then allowed the leaks to spring all over the boat, right?
So, yeah, to what degree... You have an assumption of kindness, which a lot of times, I tend to take people. I'm a trusting person. I'm not naturally cynical. I've just gotten a lot more so recently.
Yep.
You are focused on some of the questions of policy and expertise, assuming good intentions. Whereas to me, I have a real hard time figuring out how I give someone the benefit of that doubt after what I've seen the last couple of years. I understand that, ultimately I want to get to the world where we are having adult conversations. We're looking at both sides of of any trade-off. Yep. We know that the incentives of the people who are running things are to actually make people's lives better. And that's where I want to be.
Yeah.
And honestly, I wouldn't probably be here if that's the world we were living in. And the reason I'm wearing this shirt, the reason I went to the protests is because I don't think that's where the real conversation is.
Yeah.
And now I know this is a public podcast, and there are certain things that you might or might not want to go. And I really appreciate your role. Like, if you'll permit me to say, one of the things that gave me a good feeling about UAP was when I was looking into the hydroxychloroquine thing. I looked at the Palmer Foundation website, and I'm like, these articles.
He went to buy
these articles. Yep. It's the articles about the testing were already there. Like, I had spent a lot of time looking into this hypothesis testing myself, and I saw that a number of articles on his foundation's website matched what I was already finding, right? But I hadn't heard it anywhere else. The news media wouldn't cover it. Yep. So that was one of the. I didn't grow up here. I don't have any particular affiliation or opinion of people who hear the names you've grown up around since you were young. But that's one of the things that gave me a positive view of what the Palmer Foundation was trying to do is they talked about the actual science of hypothesis testing. We need to get back to like an adult conversation about a number of, like, energy policy. Same thing. Yep. We look at one side of a narrative. We pretend. Can I go here?
Yeah, we're going to go here anyway. So.
All right. Yep. Well, we pretend that child mining of cobalt in the Congo isn't happening.
Yeah.
We pretend that forced labor, construction of solar panels isn't happening. We pretend that battery creation that you need to balance out the base load power from the intermittent power of the sun and the wind doesn't require vast mining and environmental costs. Yep. They're all. So it's one of these things where we live in this Willy Wonka world of pure imagination, where we think that green energy can just come from unicorn farts.
Yeah.
And that it just shows up, like, on the Greens website it says we're gonna embrace green hydrogen. Oh, really? Okay, great. Where's that come from?
Yeah.
Electrolysis.
And how do you do electrolysis of water?
Exactly. Right.
So, okay, let's slow it down, right? Because when we talk about energy, there is so many different avenues we want to go down here. And I wanted to actually cover and pick your brain on plenty of things in this, right? So let's talk about green hydrogen first of all, because you brought it up, right? So for people that are listening and may not know what green hydrogen is, green hydrogen is apparently green because you're getting it from the electrolysis of water, right? So you basically separate your water, your H2 and your O, and you end up with hydrogen. You end up with oxygen.
Yeah, and you burn the hydrogen. That's your
fuel.
That's your fuel, and it becomes water again.
Yep.
Right. So as if it was a Anyway, go ahead.
And I think you just made me think of a movie that I think the movie was called Chain Reaction. It had Keanu Reeves in it. Do you remember that? And that movie was based on that premise. of using clean hydrogen. They were basically separating water to create hydrogen and using hydrogen to then create fuel, and then chain reaction, something started blowing up, and I can't remember the rest of the movie.
Okay.
Right? So why I wanted to bring up green hydrogen is because, yes, it sounds great in theory. However, you still need energy to extract hydrogen, right? And so you're basically requiring an input to then get hydrogen to then recreate energy.
You ever watch South Park?
Yes.
The Underpants Gnomes?
No, that I don't remember.
It was this group, these gnomes would go around, they would collect underpants.
Yeah.
And, stage 1 was collect underpants. Step 2, they didn't have a plan. And step 3, they would profit.
Yeah.
Right? So green hydrogen is the same thing. Is that, okay, what we want in the end is, clean energy that's, we're going to start with water. Step 2.
Yep.
And step 3, we have green hydrogen.
Okay.
But step 2 has, yeah.
So the cost of extracting hydrogen from water. I don't know if you have any metrics off the top of your head, but
not numbers. But the thing is that you can't. There's no such thing as a perpetual motion machine.
That's right.
In physics.
Yep.
You
need to have energy in, and so if we think about it this way,
and more energy than you get out.
Exactly, because you're going to have natural losses. It's just like in a car, you've got drivetrain losses.
That's
right. The engine could be producing 200 kilowatts at the engine, but by the
so
time you get it out
you
of the
still
back,
need your electricity input.
Yep.
Even if you think green hydrogen comes at the end, but the thing is that where that comes from is nowhere on the Greens website.
Okay.
Right. Go ahead.
So. All right. So then the next thing that would probably they'd probably want to say is that we're going to get the energy from solar,
right?
Okay, or wind. Okay, so let's talk about those two items separately. All right. I think wind is a little bit easier to talk about. Let's talk about wind first. So basically, if anyone has gone out to like country New South Wales, you might have seen like these massive, giant wind turbines sitting, on the different hills. And then occasionally people also do offshore wind. So basically, these large windmill turbines sitting in somewhere on the ocean or, off the ocean on floor and elevated to try and catch the wind. Now, the turbines are powered by wind and then, they generate electricity.
Yep.
It's basically through the motion, right? It's using eddy currents.
And it ends up, one of the things you need for efficient windmills is rare earth elements. It's an element I don't really pronounce very well, niobium or something like that. And the monopoly producer of rare earths is China, and it is a fairly toxic mining process. So in order to get your green energy, your green windmills, in order to create green electricity, to create green hydrogen, you need lots of mining. You need the rare earth elements that go in the production, in the windmills. You need the concrete. You need the carbon fiber blades. You need all these brown costs of what you pretend is green hydrogen. And just like any good narrative, if you ignore everything that doesn't fit your narrative, it's magic.
Yeah. Okay. And so I believe the turbines only last for 20 to 25 years as well.
Yeah.
And
something like that.
Are the materials recyclable? I don't think they are.
No, they get buried in landfill typically.
So the turbine blades get buried in landfill?
They call it recycling if you chop it up and you put it into concrete, that's recycling.
Okay. Otherwise,
you bury it in landfill because it's not terribly practical to chop some of the stuff and put it into concrete. But you can pretend you're recycling it by turning. You don't turn it back into windmill blades.
No. Yeah. Okay. And the other thing that I think is important to note, when it comes to wind technology, is the space required, right?
Yes,
so you can't obviously have these turbines placed back to back because the wind won't pass through it.
Yep.
So they space them out, and it is quite a significant amount of land that is required, or water space that is required to actually put these turbines on there. And then if you think about it from going into the future, if those regional towns were to be developed and things like that, and you have buildings wanting to pop up, that would then also impact the wind and that particular process. Okay. The second thing that's required, I guess, off the back of wind would be battery storage solutions.
Right.
Because they don't always operate.
Intermittent power.
Yep.
Typically, while on days the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, you need a way to smooth out that power because people aren't terribly happy, and factories especially aren't terribly happy when their power goes off and on and off and on.
Yep.
Very few a lot of electronic devices also don't function very well when you keep on flicking the power on and off. And so you need energy storage capacity, in which case what we need is
batteries.
Major battery, giant batteries with a cobalt and lithium mined materials, and the the toxic nature of a lot of of the battery mining and storage and non-recycling.
Yep. And so, the storage also requires space. So that's additional space required for that. Yep. And then I don't know if they're, I'm assuming obviously the carriers would be waterproof per se, but I don't know if they're flood proof.
The what?
So like the actual batteries, whether they be flood proof.
Yeah. I really don't know. I mean, in a lot of ways, the specifics of it are downstream of the general principle of looking at it throughout its whole life cycle, right? I mean, those technical problems that you're discussing, those are real, those are important, but you first have to decide that you're going to be an adult in the conversation and look at the whole thing, as opposed to the underpants gnomes green energy that just green hydrogen that shows up out of nowhere. I mean, you're talking like an adult in the conversation who's looking at the real trade-offs and the real technical problems and the things that have to overcome, and more power to you. But we have a problem that's upstream of that, in that we're not talking about these trade-offs at all. So that's a policy discussion would be a great adult conversation to have, which we're not having. Well, we're having it here, but we're not having.
Well, that's why I want to get into the nitty gritty, because I think it's worthwhile. So then if people do listen, then they start to think about some of these second and third order consequences.
Yes, definitely.
As I said, so my skill set is heavily geared around thinking about those long-term decisions from being in business. So, for all of my employees, I used to have a plan. I'd plan out 5 years of their life, and work out, what is the direction that your career is going to go to for where you want to be. And I say that to them not to lock them in, but to say, hey, next month when we catch up, what you actually have written last month, you might change.
Yeah.
Right. You might say, oh, I actually don't want to go in that direction anymore, because after that, the month that I just had, I experienced this and I experienced that, and this has changed my life. And the whole point of that is that's like your check-in process for when you're doing your flight plan, right? Because whether you're taking a plane or you're on a boat, either the current or the wind is going to take you in a slightly different direction to where you want to go.
Yep, you have to
so
adjust.
You cannot fly directly from A to B, right? It's the same thing, going into space. You can't just go and take a trajectory and then go, oh yeah, this is going to get me to the moon, right? You got to take into account the gravitational fields of the different planets and blah, 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 and the sun. And, it's going to alter your trajectory to get to where you want to be. And that requires a constant check-in, right? You got to pause along the way to go, okay, wind's changed, this has changed, that's changed, conditions have changed.
Adjust course.
Let's adjust course. So let's talk a little bit about solar.
Sure.
Right? So, and let me start with this, right? And so I'm not anti any of these technologies.
If it works, it works.
Exactly.
As long as you're looking at the whole trade-off.
Yes. So my particular perspective is, I think, as with most things, I think a multimodal approach is actually the best way to combat any sort of problem. Because I think a lot of the times when we try and I'll use physical injury as an example, right? So a lot of the times, let's say somebody sprains their ankle, right? So what we immediately look to do after somebody sprains their ankle is typically, you would then go and ice the ankle, right? Which is fairly common sense, right? You're trying to reduce the inflammation of the sprain in the ankle and reduce the swelling, reduce the bruising. So theoretically, you could have a faster recovery time. Now, what typically happens, post injury is that there is some form of compensation. So when I say compensation, it's compensation in your own body to then accommodate for that injury. So if the ankle is sore, right, the muscles, whether above stream or downstream of it, so whether it's in your actual foot or in your shin or your leg, is now going to tighten up so that when you walk on that ankle or you move that ankle, it's trying to avoid pain, right? And so, I can give you a great example of this, because my father had a bad knee for a very long time and compensated so much that it's impacted the hip on the alternate side, right? Because you're putting more pressure through the hip on the other side, and that is the compensation problem that you have as a result of that, right? So typically when you would treat that kind of a problem, you now need to approach it from more than one perspective. So going back to my example of the sprained ankle, in that recovery phase, it might mean that you actually have to work on the muscle tissue, both above and below the ankle, and maybe even further up, depending on how bad the condition was and how long it's been there. Because it could have traveled up the leg into the lower back, into the shoulder, into your neck. Like it propagates, right? So, the reason why I bring up that example and why I talk about that multimodal approach is because I think wind and solar have a particular use, right? But it's probably not the use that people would want to espouse. So as an example, when I was running a Holden dealership in Castle Hill, we actually had solar panels installed on the roof.
Yeah, it can make sense. Yeah.
And it was because, dealership obviously takes quite a bit of size.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, I was quite interested in, when it all happened. And I thought it was interesting because, our energy needs throughout the day for our workshop on a good sunny day was more than covered by the solar panels on the roof. Fantastic.
Yep.
Because at the end of the day, that business isn't open at nighttime. We're not using any power at nighttime. So our energy bills were obviously heavily reduced. And I think that, to me, is a perfect example of a good application of solar, right? When I start to see, or read articles about, we're going to clear all this land, right, to then put a solar farm there, right, which is quite significant in terms of...
Different set of trade-offs.
It's a different set of trade-offs.
Rooftop solar is going to have a different life cycle calculation than the giant solar farms.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And so, okay, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I actually was looking at something on the NASA website, because they had this website for kids, and it was talking about... what was it talking about? It was talking about, so I was looking up greening of the world based on carbon emissions, right?
Oh, right.
And so it actually came up with a NASA website. So basically, because we have more CO2 emissions, one of the consequences of that is that the world is actually greener than it has been in the past. And this has actually been verified through NASA footage from, in space, looking at the Earth and the amount of green space, and the green foliage and things like that has obviously increased. And one of the side effects of the green foliage increasing is because plants, through their process of, I think it's phototranspiration or something like that, then has actually resulted in, it helps to reduce the temperature of the planet as well.
Yep.
So what was anticipated to be a 5-degree increase may only be a 2-degree increase because 3 degrees through phototranspiration of the plants has actually cut it down.
Right. But from a narrative point of view, that's heresy, and I have to burn you at the stake. Right? Because we're only allowed to talk about the negative aspects, and we can't talk about the ways in which, some of these things might be positive. So, I'm sorry, you got to burn.
Yeah. So if we take that to the extreme, right? Let's say for whatever reason there was 0 CO2.
Yep.
Plants would die.
Yep, true. In fact, actually,
everything would die.
I think the below about 220, and I'm not going to get that number right, parts per million, you have made it not even at 0.
Yep.
Not that far below the pre-industrial level of CO2, as far as how many parts per million it was, is the place where a lot of plants can't
survive.
Yep. Yes, right.
Yep. Okay. And so, I just thought that was an interesting point to raise, because if people want to actually, get into the detail, that's why I'd prefer to talk about the detail.
Yeah.
Because it's an interesting point to think about that, if we suddenly had, 0 CO2, well, life as we know it would probably cease to exist.
Definitely.
Right? Because everything operates in a balance. Right, there has to be some CO2, there has to be some oxygen. There's all these things that make up.
Plants we have are adapted to a certain level of CO2 it does solve itself. So, if the plants die, then the other creatures die, and it's in a balance for a reason.
Yep.
And having some wisdom and understanding of what that reason is can allow you to try to understand what happens if we change one thing or another.
Exactly.
As long as we're not driven by a particular narrative that only lets us look at one thing.
Yeah. So that's part of the issue that I find with solar is that they go, we're going to just put it in places where there's lots of sun and, but what else is on that land, right?
Yeah.
So typically in places where there's lots of sun, there's also still going to be some bushes and trees and things like that.
Right.
Right. And so, one of the interesting things that I did was I actually looked up where our current solar farms were. And I put it up on Google Maps so that I could see, what was the surrounding area looking like. And, even the one that's in the Northern Territory has, there's bush and shrubbery there, right? So, you might think that it's inconsequential to clear 10 hectares of shrubbery or whatever. I think the stats that I was looking at was about to produce 1 megawatt of energy, the land size to be cleared would need to be between 2 and 3 hectares. And then, when I tried to extrapolate that out, so what I actually did was I actually looked at the size of some of these things. I think 2 to 3 hectares is actually a little bit conservative. It's actually more than that, because if you look at the size of the commercial solar farms, the land size that they have versus what they claim is their output, is the number would be higher, right? And the other thing that I thought was interesting in relation to that is that I think there was an article that I read just saying that one of the solar farms had to downgrade their profit projections because for whatever reasons they only produced 20% less. They produced 20% less electricity than what they were anticipating, right? So there are these other sort of factors that we haven't really begun to take into consideration.
So the first thing you got to decide is, are you going to be an adult in the conversation and look at the whole life cycle, right? Without subsidies, from beginning to end, and look at all the impacts. And I'm really glad to be talking to an adult who wants to look at, all of those things. So, first you have to mine the silica. Then you also have to keep in mind that a lot of the dirty jobs that happen on both ends, both the mining and the recycling, get shipped off to areas with lax environmental regulations, so that we can feel good in the middle, having our solar farm. But at the end, all those solar panels are being reprocessed or taken apart or thrown into landfills in poorer countries, causing environmental damage there. And also, the mining is it's the child miners in the Congo, it's the silica miners in China, it's the and I'm not trying to say that it's all bad. I'm just saying you have to count it all. And just like you're talking about, you have to strip out the subsidies. You have to count the fact that carbon emissions are going to happen when you clear that land. That's not done with Tesla bulldozers, and even the Tesla bulldozers still have to be charged up, assuming there were. So the very first thing, and the part we're failing at from the very beginning, is being adult in the conversation and counting the whole process. And that's the biggest tragedy is that from a policy point of view, the Greens seem to just be focusing on this magical green hydrogen without a discussion of the rest of the story. But I think we're failing at job one, which is, hey, we're going to talk about the whole life cycle, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Because if you're not going to agree on that, nothing else matters.
How long do solar panels last for anyway? I've never really thought about. I haven't looked into that personally.
Yeah, it's changed over time. Like one of the things, which generation of technology we're talking about matters, and that's one of the things that when it gets between nuclear and solar, is that people point out Fukushima or Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island. Plants that were designed in the 1960s, and there were no photovoltaics in the until the 70s. And even then, the ones that are connected to commercial grids didn't happen until 10 years after that or so. And so are we talking today's solar panels, or are we talking? So I think it's on the order of 10 to 20 years. I'm not an expert in that field. That's what I vaguely remember from and then once those are done, a lot of these solar panels are glue the some of the toxic materials in them are part of polymers and glues that are layered in order
to laminate.
Laminate. That is very difficult to recycle, if not practically not practically recyclable.
Okay, and so then as a result of that, I don't think we recycle them anywhere in Australia. We ship them to China, right?
That's right, or somewhere with a high tolerance to environmental laxity. Yes.
Actually, like I think some of them also end up in Africa or something like that.
A lot of our computer parts end up in third world countries to be picked apart by poor children in non
ideal conditions.
Non-ideal conditions.
Okay. Let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk nuclear, right?
Yep.
And we'll have to split the conversation because I think we should. I like talking about fusion as well. So
Great.
So for people that obviously don't know, there are two forms of technology in the nuclear space. There is fusion and there is fission. Fission is the common one that is available, today for commercial application in terms of, a nuclear reactor to generate electricity. And fusion is the pipe dream that everybody is.
Our sun.
Yes.
It's a pipe dream on Earth for now, but it is what ultimately powers our planet.
Yeah.
But yes, not for domestic consumption.
Consumption, yeah. So there are some great experiments actually. The tokamak reactors that they're building in France, and there's some organizations that are trying to do it privately, and basically a tokamak is like, you imagine like it's a donut, right?
Yeah. You have to have a magnetic field that contains the plasma with enough power so that when the atoms fuse, you need to put the reason why you have fusion in the sun is that the gravity at a certain level of mass, the hydrogen ball will auto-ignite because there's so much pressure and temperature in the middle that you have the conditions necessary for fusion to overcome the natural electric resistance of
trying to push it apart.
Yeah. So if you have a proton and a proton, they repel each other, and to get two nuclei to come together, you need a great deal of pressure and temperature, so that you have that process. And so, to reproduce that kind of environment on Earth requires enormously powerful magnetic fields to hold things together, and then you can generate a lot of power from that, which turning that into a reliable energy source, that's a huge technical.
That's right.
Problem.
Yeah, and we're talking like the degrees of the sun, millions of degrees, right? So, but it when you think about it, like I always think about the Marvel movies. It's like what Iron Man's got in his chest,
right.
Like
the arc
reactor, right? Which would be some form of a baby fusion reactor, suspended by highly powered magnets, and the process I think is they fuse 4 hydrogen atoms together to produce helium as the offshoot. Which is interesting because, like helium doesn't really stay, in our atmosphere, right? Like it goes off into space.
Yeah. So the fusion in the sun, hydrogen to helium, unless it's a supernova, and in which case that's where we get the heavier elements from. You can combine helium into other things, but once you get above, I think, iron, it's endothermic. The combination of higher elements actually takes away energy rather than adds to energy. But hydrogen to helium yields quite a bit of energy. They had the conception that there would be cold fusion, that you could do it in kind of a glass jar but that never panned out. It's one of those things we don't know what's possible.
Yeah.
Things seem impossible until someone comes up with a new idea and something happens.
Yeah.
Just like nuclear power.
Yeah.
That was not in the realm of conception, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Or 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And now it's viably powers. So, hopefully we'll figure something out with fusion, but for now, fission.
Fission is the way.
And then in fission, you have uranium and thorium are mostly your two options.
So, and just speaking a little bit on, the like when we talk about developing things. So as an example, electric vehicles are all the rage at the present moment, touted to save our climate and all this sort of stuff. Electric vehicles were first came onto the market, like I think 100 years ago. The first electric car was made over 100 years ago, but we abandoned that technology because it was difficult, so to speak, and the range and all those sorts of things. It was a lot easier to then develop an internal combustion engine, which had better longevity and usage and things like that. And now we sort of come full circle again, and EVs seem to be the way that a lot of car manufacturers want to go. And the reason why I bring that up is because sometimes it's not necessarily that the technology is bad, right? It's just that at that particular point in time, it meets a need, right?
Yeah, and you need the right, like there are a lot of technologies that if they come along at the wrong time, you don't have the components that will make it work. So, if we had a new battery technology, that might make certain things possible that otherwise are not currently practical. And so, your material sciences go along with your other, engineering components, and certain things that weren't possible or practical become so.
Yep. Yep. And so, that sort of leads into the discussion about fission, right? Because when it comes to fission reactors, they do get a pretty bad rap because, the technology that people often reference in relation to accidents and things like that is old technology. And so part of the reason, why we don't have nuclear technology in Australia, bar the one ANSTO reactor we have here in Sydney, or the Lucas Heights reactor, which they use for nuclear medicine, is because, I think back in 1998, they introduced some legislation which prohibits the manufacture or creation of nuclear power plants, et cetera. And I think, to me, it's a bit remiss, when you think about it from a multimodal perspective, is that, there's no place really in Australia to study nuclear physics, unless I think ANU probably offers it. I think that's the only university in Australia that offers it. And if you were to study that, your career outlook is pretty limited. Yeah. Because where are you going to go? You got nowhere in Australia to work at the present moment. So what that means is that, our best and brightest that, are compelled to study that kind of thing end up overseas in France, America, China, doing research and their work in those countries. And so it's a bit of to me, I feel like it's a bit of a brain drain on our economy and our country to lose, these bright people just because we have this legislation that doesn't allow us to actually, work on the technology. And, the reality is that if we had a nuclear program here in Australia, we could probably even do it better than maybe what some of the other countries could do. Yeah,
it's not just a human capital drain, but, there are a lot of things about nuclear that are much better than a number of the alternatives. You have baseload power, for one. The problem with wind and solar is it's intermittent.
Yep.
Nuclear is good baseload power. It's also one of those things where, the modern designs can be made walk-away safe. All the coolant drains out. It still doesn't melt down. You can use thorium rather than uranium, so you don't have a high nuclear proliferation risk, because it's much harder to make bombs out of thorium byproducts than it is the uranium cycle. The reason we started with the uranium cycle was actually not to make power, but to make bombs. That is why we had, the first number of reactors in the U.S. was about producing the plutonium that we needed to make nuclear bombs. So
it came out of defense research.
Yes, right.
Can I digress there?
Yeah.
I had a conversation with another high school mate of mine who's in the research space, and he sent me this really good article. I don't think he was expecting me to digest the thing in full, but I read through everything that was sort of presented, and it was talking about research funding in Australia, right? And I might be slightly off on some of my figures here, but I remember it was basically saying that we spend about $11 billion from a government perspective on research funding, and when I looked at that number, I was actually a bit sort of miffed. And the reason why is because, I'd come from working in with automotive companies where Toyota probably spends, upwards of 30 billion a year. Daimler, Mercedes-Benz spends 27 billion a year on research and development. Volkswagen would probably somewhere in that vicinity. And here we are as a country spending less than what some of these private companies are spending. And, I guess, some of the other points that I picked up off the back of that is that the way that our research grants are structured between federal, state levels, it's not cohesive.
Yeah.
So to me, it really, what sort of, was being yelled out to me was that we lack a real vision in terms of what are we trying to achieve with our spending.
Yeah.
Right. And as much as, people, the pacifists would hate that, we're spending money to develop, defense applications and things like that, or defense force applications and
the real world.
Yeah. But that is actually what drives a lot of the innovation for the commercial world. Right. So that we have this need that we want to, defend ourselves or do these kinds of things as a country. But then that technology then proliferates down to commercial application that then we get the benefit of.
Yeah, and the NASA spinoffs from the space program is one of the oft talked about all the technologies that came from the capital investment that we used to go to the moon. And there were a great number of things that we use regularly that came from that.
Can you give some examples?
I'll give you one funny one.
Okay.
Tang. No,
Tang?
the orange drink.
Orange
Yeah,
drink?
yeah.
Really?
Yeah. That was something developed for it was one of the astronauts. Tang sales went up high during the Apollo missions because they getting food into space, that's a difficult thing. Drinks don't even have gravity to hold them down.
Yep.
So everything has to be so many things have to be figured out once you're in a zero G environment. There was one incident where Tang sales dropped because one of the astronauts on a hot mic said something like, "Wow, this really gives me the farts." But all kinds of like the mirrored sunglasses, the rocket technology itself, material sciences, like we talked about. There's so many. If you want to develop something like fusion, or even new battery technology, there are some material sciences questions and engineering problems, and these things they go lockstep. The things in your mobile phone wouldn't have been possible from a technological point of view, from a material sciences point of view 30 years ago. It just, certain things didn't exist that it's required to do that any swiping on a mobile phone.
Yeah.
So when it comes to you're talking about the public research budget. The very first question is do you have the right incentives? Because there is definitely a place for government spending on research and development where the private sector, in some cases, they know they can sell what's happening and they're willing to take the risk, and they can borrow the capital or raise the capital and create something new.
Yep.
And that's great. And there are certain other places where, the private sector knows they can't take the risk. Like, for instance, a thorium a nuclear reactor for power production. There's, if you're from a private point of view, there's a lot of uncertainties, and there have been a lot of nuclear reactors that they've spent $1 billion on and never been allowed to start up because some new change of government came and they shut down the program, and there is no private investor who's going to be willing to take that chance.
Sure.
And so that's a place where, in an adult world, it makes sense to talk about a public research budget, or once it becomes tested and normalized, the commercial sector can take over from the private sector.
Yep.
But again, we're dealing with a world where the government is got the correct vision in mind to act in the public interests. Unlike our health regulators, who won't fund the testing of off-patent medications in order to find their efficacy, because they know when they get out of their role in the public sphere, they can walk into the private pharmaceutical companies and get paid as long as they keep all the off-patent stuff left out of the conversation.
Yeah. No. Great. I love how you can link it. So, okay, let's, and I agree with you. When we talk about basic research, I think that is the one thing that, that governments, as in government, we should be focused on, because these are the things that will proliferate down into helping everyday citizens, right?
Yeah. There's a role to play, and it needs to be done with a life cycle cost in mind, with the correct incentives in mind, with transparency, with open debate.
Yep.
With anyone who's just putting down a one-sided narrative being called out for what it is.
Yep.
All those things are the prerequisite to an adult conversation that will lead to good public policy and an energy solution that keeps all the major issues in mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so part of the reason why, manufacturing costs can be high in Australia is because of the energy cost.
Yeah.
Right? So if the more expensive energy is, the more expensive your costs of your goods to be made are. So, if we are looking at it approaching it from a multimodal perspective, you should be looking at anything that's positive that will help drive down the cost of energy. So I guess let's talk a little bit about fission. So fission is the process of splitting atoms. We take a source material like uranium or thorium.
Yep.
I think, Australia, we are one of the largest.
Yeah, both materials.
Yep.
You're
I think
have the
we're
largest
3
reserves.
in thorium and whether it's 1 or 2 in uranium.
Depending on how you count reserves,
Yeah, and basically, the process behind it is that we take, the source uranium or thorium or whatever, it gets irradiated.
Yeah, so there have been places in the world where a natural chain reaction has taken place.
Okay.
There's there's a place where because one of the things, when you slow down the neutrons, they're more likely to split a target. And so there have been a couple of natural reactors where when water comes in, it actually self-generates this chain reaction. Wow. In a bomb, you want a critical mass of uranium-235 to be held together long enough that that enough atoms are split to create the biggest explosion possible. Okay. In a reactor, what you want is slow and steady power, if you slow down the neutrons, it slows down the process, and it also makes it more likely to split the following atom. So you want a chain reaction that is controlled and cooled, but the heat of it generating the production of electricity through spinning a turbine typically.
Yeah. Okay. So so does that mean that when they produce the rods, like they put some layering in them to slow down the neutrons?
Yeah.
So it's sandwiched with other materials or something?
There's a lot of different design types. First you need somewhat enriched uranium. Typically, I think I'm going to get the numbers a bit wrong, but in nature, uranium-235 might be 2%, 1% of uranium, most of the rest being uranium-238. You need a higher level of uranium-235 to create a chain reaction. And so you enrich the uranium and you put it into rods. You want to layer it with something that keeps everything together, also at a high temperature. You can make some of the modern designs, they called pebble bed reactors, where if you encase it in a high enough temperature material, even if you drain the coolant, it's not going to melt down. So there are walk-away safe designs. Yep. So then you have the coolant that the rods are in, yep. And you also have rods that will absorb neutrons. I think they're made out of graphite, if I remember correctly. So that if you want to scram the reactor, if you want to slow it down, you push the rods in, it absorbs the neutrons, shuts down the reactor. So that's you got to have that balance between having enough chain reaction and not too much, and making sure you have your coolant. Yep. But again, where we have had problems in the past are things that are designs from the 60s. And so the modern designs can be made to be walk-away safe. All the coolant drains out, you go away, nothing melts down. They can also be designed to actually consume more radioactive radioactive waste than they produce. Because one of the main problems, can we go into this? Is that right?
Absolutely.
So, once the power is produced, you still have the daughter isotopes from the uranium. And there are going to be all kinds. Eventually everything goes down to some non-radioactive element. But in the meantime, if it decays quickly, it's going to become energy, and you can use that to power things. If it goes to a very long-lived daughter product, then you don't have to worry about it because it's not very radioactive. But in the intermediate phase, there are certain elements that are going to be radioactively hot to be around for a long time. And so some of these old reactors have these radioactive, what they call radioactive waste, that you need to find a solution for over the course where it's radioactively hot. Now, that can definitely be done. France, produces most of their power from nuclear, and right now they're one of the few countries in Europe that's not looking at an energy crisis.
That's right.
Right, because everyone else is depending on Russian gas, and France is one of the least affected countries. Yeah, countries, because they're mostly nuclear. Yeah. And in order to kind of have someplace safe to store your waste, all you have to do is just let it sit for a long period of time, and the degree to which it is radioactively hot decays over time. But on the other hand, with modern designs, you can continue to break those products down to the point where it is safe much sooner than it would have been otherwise. Yep. So you can actually consume more waste than you produce with the modern Generation 4 designs.
Yep. So 2 points I'd like to bring up, talking about France, right? So, France obviously borders Germany, and Germany have gone through their process of trying to decommission some of their nuclear power plants. So if you actually look up the statistics about energy importing and exporting, so France actually exports nuclear energy into Germany.
I didn't know that, but yeah,
right?
I believe it.
As a result
Especially now.
Yeah, and so this is one of the things that, you know, I think people don't really consider is that, you know, I think, you know, in the future, yes, in Australia, we will eventually move away from some of the coal and some of those things.
Eventually we have to.
Yeah, eventually we have to. But you need to make sure that we do have a reliable source of energy to replace it, right?
Yep.
And that, you know, in my eyes, it'd come from nuclear. And I think, you know, as I said, solar and wind play a role, but it's not on the level on the same kind of level, right? And that's just purely from the constraints in terms of, you know, what is the land size required to generate the same amount of electricity, blah, 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 blah. So the second thing that I thought to bring up from what you were just talking about is, so the radioactive waste that is typically produced, I think would have been in the order of like thousands of years. And then, but once you go through this process of using the waste material and recycling it and also converting that into energy again, it then comes down to, I think, about 200 years.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
So, you know, if you think about that, like, and people might go, oh, but that's 200 years. So let's put this in perspective, right? So throughout this whole last couple of years, you know, we've produced how many surgical masks?
Right.
And how many of those have been disposed of and ended up, you know, whether it's in landfill, whether it's in oceans, whether it's whatever else. And part of the materials that go into those disposable masks or the surgical masks, some of those materials would take about 450 years to degrade. Right? So if you put that in perspective of how many masks we've all used over the last couple of years versus the energy production. So, and to give you an idea, I think so one gummy bear sized equivalent of nuclear fuel, so a pellet of nuclear fuel the size of a gummy bear, is equivalent to, I think it's 1 ton of coal.
The energy density of nuclear as a power source is orders of magnitude more than fossil fuels. So fossil fuels all use a chemical reaction. Whereas nuclear, a completely different process. The energy density is huge. And in terms of the amount of waste you produce from coal, you know, the byproducts of that, or even if you were just doing solar panels or wind, you still have unrecyclable material, you know, both from the mining side and on the end, that it's a large amount of material. Whereas from nuclear, I think the size of your pinky will be the waste you produce in 10 years. So you know, in terms of its environmental impact, in terms of also energy security, you know, the ability to rely on yourself rather than, you know, mining material from cobalt from the Congo, you know, or getting it shipped on tankers from the Middle East, you know, that's also a benefit that is really hard to shake a stick at.
Absolutely. All right, let's. I want to talk a little bit more about the walkaway safe, because you love using that line. And so basically, let's talk about, you know, some of the previous nuclear disasters. Right. So I think there's been 3 in recent history, and so is it 3 Mile Island?
3 Mile Island was one. Yep.
So there's 3 Mile Island. There's obviously Chernobyl. And then there was Fukushima. Right. So I think, you know, the stats from Fukushima was basically nobody died as a direct relation of the radiation or whatever from the fallout of Fukushima. And I think one of the untold stories of Fukushima was that when the tsunami hit, people were actually taking shelter in an alternate nuclear facility because of the strength of the facility. Right. But what they found, I think, as being, you know, when we talk about walkaway safe and why that's an important term, is because in those 3 nuclear disasters, so to speak, part of the issues with why there was a meltdown is because there was an element of a person was required to do something.
You need active cooling.
Yes.
So you have to take some action in order to make sure that the reactor doesn't melt down. Because even if you scram the reactor, you put the graphite rods in, make sure that the chain reaction stops, it's still hot enough to kind of turn into a slag that then can continue to burn. And so, you know, the old designs, you had to have active cooling. And a lot of times even the reactor itself couldn't wasn't designed in a way that it could generate its own power to
keep cooling.
To keep cooling, right? It had to have an external source, which is a real vulnerability.
So that was the issue, I think, at Fukushima.
Well, they did lose power from the outside, and then what you have all in those designs is backup generators.
Yep.
So they were on the roof, the diesel generators, and I think that'll get you, might get you an extra week, and then you have to get. But the problem is the tsunami blew the diesel generators off the roof, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
And so you lost your primary, you lost your backup, and you're instantly in a crisis. Whereas that's not necessary from a design point of view. With, again, just like with everything else, in solar, you didn't have the material sciences to create photovoltaics when Fukushima was designed. So it's not a good comparison to say, Fukushima, that's the risks we're running with nuclear. No, we have new materials. Those materials, combined with some engineering design elements, can make sure that if you lose all your cooling, you still not have a reactor meltdown.
Yep.
So yeah. Please.
Yeah, and so I think the other issue with some of the early generations of nuclear reactor design was that they were using, water with some other chemicals as the form of coolant, which obviously, it has to be highly pressurized.
Right.
If you think about it, like, in your car radiator, right? So, you have this mixture of water and coolant, and it might go up to, say, 120 degrees under pressure. And obviously the temperatures that you're dealing with when you're dealing with nuclear energy is quite significantly high. And I think, the new technology, uses a different medium. So, we've moved to either salt or a fluoride style solution where the melting point of salt is like 700 or 800 degrees, which then means that the system doesn't need to be pressurized.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So you have, different, there are a number of different designs, depending on, you're absolutely right. Liquid salt, and the fluoride. The trade-offs can include, if you don't have pressurized water, a steam explosion was a worry. You can mitigate that through low pressure reactors, like you say. That's definitely one way to do it. The other thing about some of these liquid salt reactors is you can also breed more fuel than you consume. So not only can you consume more waste than you produce, but with breeder reactors, you can take. Remember how we talked about with uranium-235, you have to enrich it in order to burn it. With the breeder reactors, you can create more fuel than you use, and so you can take some of the non-fertile thorium or non-fertile uranium and turn it into usable fuel, and it's a tremendously long-lasting. If we look at our reserves and that technology, we can have a lot of energy for a long time.
Yep. And that's the other thing is, like, I think when it comes to innovation, right? Like we talk about now, we're at this process where we can turn it from a radioactive byproduct that takes 1,000 years to break down to a couple of hundred years to break down. At some point we're probably going to be able to get it lower than that, right? And I think one of the other points to raise on that is that we're exposed to radiation in our daily lives every day, right?
Absolutely.
So
that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that there's a radiation term that's called a banana equivalent dose, because every banana has a certain amount of radioactive potassium. We all have a certain amount of radioactivity in our body at all times. Just like with the poisons we talked about, there's no such thing as a poison, just a poisonous dose. So the amount of it is kind of this mysterious thing that a lot of people think, the right amount is zero. Well, if you're not getting any radiation, you're going to die because you need some of these. You need the potassium in order for your muscles to function. So the amount of cosmic background radiation we get, I forget what the banana equivalent dose is. Maybe it's something like it's eating 1,000 bananas. Now that number is not correct. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we do live among radiation sources. The trick is you don't want too much of it, especially in a short period of time. And so if we can get past the idea that like any amount of radioactivity is bad, it is not an adult conversation. It is a narrative that is sometimes used to attack nuclear power, but it's not at all true.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, if you go to the dentist, You know, typically what I've seen every day, every time lately that I've been to the dentist, like every year they'll take a X-ray of your teeth.
Yep.
Right. So as a result of that, you know, that's a form of radiation. You know, they follow their process so that, you know, when they do it, they exit the room, they hit the button, and that does the thing. But yeah, it is a form of radiation. So you're getting irradiated
every time you take an overseas flight.
Yep.
So there's a really cool. I wish I had. Maybe I can attach it to your notes where it shows graphically. Basically, that one dental X-ray is the equivalent of 10 bananas, and one chest X-ray is the equivalent of X number of bananas, and so and then you get a sense of what the radiation we live with in any case to do simple things. Even people who live at high altitude, some people who live in Denver get a higher radiation exposure than people who live at sea level.
Yep.
These things are all around us, and the question is, what you don't want to have is above a certain threshold. We've been able to detect increases in cancers, and so as a result of Chernobyl and Fukushima, you can run the all-cause mortality and find and the normal rates of cancer and realize that yes, maybe some number of people had cancers that they wouldn't have otherwise had. The number of deaths from some of those cancers are going to be lower than the cancers that coal pollution has created, or even the silica miners for the solar panels in China have it's very bad for the respiratory system. There are deaths from mining in the Congo for the batteries, from mining the silica in China, mining the rare earths. All these things have human costs.
Yep.
And so again, if we're going to be an adult in the conversation, we're going to look at all at all the things and not just point to the 10 people that died fighting the fire in Chernobyl, or the certain number of cancer rates that increased in Fukushima for some number of people, and I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, because everything has a cost.
Yep, absolutely. All right, I think we covered nuclear off pretty well. Can we switch gears a bit?
Yeah.
So I want to know how did you end up in Australia?
It's interesting. I think I mentioned, one of the things that's fairly defining is a high curiosity. So I like travel. It's a lot of people spend money on things. I like experiences. When you travel, you question assumptions you've had. Oh, people I thought always drive on this side of the road, and now I have to figure this out. And it challenges you and it makes you grow.
Yes.
Particularly after Pete passed away, I spent a fair bit of time traveling and figuring things out.
So you just went solo, or?
Some places, I went with to visit friends.
Yep.
Some places I went with friends, and some places I went solo. And Australia was a place that Pete said that we should always go. That we should go together. He traveled a lot for his work with the Air Force, and really enjoyed his time here. When I came here, out of all the places I've ever been, I like to say it's the first place I've ever went to that felt like home, which is really strange because I never felt like New York was my home.
Yeah.
And I've given a fair bit of thought to this, that every place has a culture and a natural environment. And, some people love New York. My dad came to New York, and New York is his home. He grew up in, Ambato, Ecuador. Yep. And, New York was a very different world, and he loved the energy. But, it's a little bit of an adversarial energy. People, they say, you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. It's high energy. A lot of people live in Manhattan. They haven't seen the horizon in 20 years. I knew that after when I went to uni that I would go south.
Yep.
So I just didn't realize how far
south you were
I would end up. Yeah. The people, the environment, I just loved it here.
Yep.
That's there's one tangent I could think of, but
let's go.
Yeah, okay.
We're here. We might as well go down that river.
Well, that one is so. One of the things that I love about here, the people are friendly. I remember going from a bus in Sydney to a few days later being on a bus in New York.
Yeah.
And the bus driver, in terms of how they would handle certain situations, it was just very, very different. But one of the things that I've found sad in the last couple of years is it seems like some of the most polite, cooperative societies in the world have been the ones that have been visited the worst from government authoritarianism. That's really shocked me. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, some of the most wonderful cultures that I've seen. I mean, it's friendly, cooperative, and then somehow in the last couple of years, it just seems like we've been pushed in a way and in a direction that's just been really surprising. So I've kind of wondered. I've given that a little bit of thought over the last a year or two, and it seems like in some ways. The goodness of people has sort of been hijacked. In sales, when you go into a mall and someone says, "Hey, I want to talk to you," right? There's a hijack of your politeness that comes from a salesperson who reaches out their hand, right? Like when they do that, they know that you think it's impolite to not engage with them, right? Yeah. You feel this pressure of, a person with a smile is reaching out their hand. How could I not? Yeah. Right. And so your sense of what a good person would do is being hijacked in order to create a sale or a contribution to something that you're not necessarily intending on at the time. And I think people's goodness and trust has been hijacked by, government authorities and health regulators who are acting in a way that has really stunned me. But that's
look, I think that's an interesting point, right? So, my thoughts on that is that we as a culture in Australia, we've had it pretty good. Our lives have been pretty good.
Yes.
I'm so grateful to my parents, having come to a country like Australia, so that I could grow up here.
Very much myself too.
And we almost have this idea that she'll be right. Like that's the Australian mentality. Somebody else will sort it out. Yeah, we'll be right. And so you don't really. I think a lot of the times, and I think this is particularly what I'm noticing. Having to talk more about politics is that a lot of people, and it's almost like people don't want to engage in conversations about politics because they view it. Politics and religion, they're the two things you got to stay away from because they're divisive, right? But they're only divisive if you approach it like a dickhead. Right. If you go and say, you got to believe the same things that I believe,
right? That's right.
Or you start, telling people that they're idiots because they not do this or they don't do that, like that. Yeah, that's of course. Then it's going to be very divisive. But if we can actually, as we said, have an adult conversation about it, we can actually broach some of those things. And I always think, irrespective of where people think they sit on in terms of their political leanings or their religious leanings, that you're probably going to realize, when you actually have a conversation is. You're more alike to the other person than you're different, right? And I think ultimately even for all these people that are really big on the green agenda and all that sort of stuff, I think their heart ultimately is in the right place. They're thinking that they want Australia to be a great place.
I'm sure that's true.
The question is what are you prioritizing in terms of your values over that, right? So I have this real thing where I really hope that irrespective of whatever the outcome is in the election. And the reason why I say that is because, if you look at what's going on in America, it's still very divided. I feel like, just based on what we see in the media, right? So, but I really hope that, regardless of the way people vote, that they don't think, my team lost, so therefore, I need to shit on this other team. Like, that's not the approach to have to it because, to wish your government to fail, right, is basically asking for your country to fail, right? So I actually don't wish ScoMo to make stupid decisions and fail because at the end of the day, we are the people that suffer as a result of it. I'd prefer that if we could all, unify and rally around, whoever the elected leader is to try and help them to make smarter decisions, right? So that is the sort of approach that I view this with. And I know that I've been called, an idealist as a result of that, right? Because, people say, oh, you're too idealistic, that to think that, people could actually do that. I don't think it's too far-fetched, because if you can actually have, conversations about it, I welcome anybody on this podcast. So if there is somebody out there that wants to talk about your green agenda and all that sort of stuff, please don't glue your hands to my microphone or anything like that. I saw a video the other day about some climate activist gluing his hand to a microphone. And I'm like, please don't do that, because you're in my house. So, right. But I'm more than happy to talk to anybody and have a reasonable conversation to understand how they formulated their ideas, right?
Yeah.
Because this is the thing that I find really interesting, is that people have had, I could have had a very similar experience to somebody else growing up, but how we view the problem, our lenses that we use to view the problem, could be really, really different.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those. So there are a lot of different ways to go through life, and a lot of different perspectives. And one of the beautiful things I think about, the Enlightenment democracies, the free societies, is that it gives people a lot of bandwidth to guide their own path. In the Soviet system, you were told what career you were going to have, and you were told where you could move and where you couldn't, and you had to get a permission slip for everything. The idea in a free society is, well, there are certain things you can't do, which are, just violate other people's rights. And apart from that, you can explore this, explore that. That allows people to kind of go their own way freely, go with people, go without people, explore different ideas. And that, I think, is a prerequisite for, people sort of moving forward together, is the ability to explore freely and have the freedom to make those choices. And that's the prerequisite. You see, when you say, I don't want any government to fail, well, I was thinking, I agree and I disagree. If they're all trying, if that government is trying to take away our fundamental human rights, then I want them to fail. Yeah. Right. So I don't want or you could say, I want them to succeed, not in the way they're going.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
So,
I want them to listen. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the prerequisites of the conversation, from a policy point of view, you have to look at the whole life cycle cost. You can't just pick, the green energy at the end of the rainbow. You have to look at before and after and during, and compare it to, that's one prerequisite. Another prerequisite is, are you allowing people to make decisions as free individuals? And as far as policy goes, are we looking at, I want the government to be able to do positive things for the lives of for instance, like we talked about, funding research into things that the commercial industry, we look at their incentives and they're not going to do it, and it's important. And to have an adult conversation about, yes, we're going to, that makes sense to fund.
Funds for that. Yeah.
Like for instance, the testing of off-patent medications, or the creation of the first few thorium reactors in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Makes sense from an adult point of view.
Yeah.
And so, but we have some deconstruction work from my point of view to do first in terms of how we are not having those adult conversations, and how we're forcing people to do things that are clearly not about increasing their health or their well-being or their freedom, because there are certain things that we've done that clearly can't be made sense of if that objective was health and well-being and human rights.
Yep.
Like I can't, I don't know what the motivation is, but I can't make sense of it from those points of view.
Yeah. So there's it's the old, or not old, but it's the sort of opposite ends of personal responsibility versus, being able to blame other people for decisions that are made, or having somebody else take accountability. Right. So I think, this is where, the government walks a fine line, because ideally, I guess from my perspective, my views are that, the government should be thinking about big picture things, because unfortunately, when you start to make nuanced policies, you are never going to appease everybody. Right. So from that perspective, I always view I'd prefer the government to just focus on the big picture, visions, goals, those things from a country perspective. How do we make Australia a wealthier country? How do we make Australia a better place to live? How do we, take our place forward? And then when it comes to the daily lives of people, I view that as a personal responsibility issue, right? And it was interesting because I think, when you read the Liberal Party values, as I did when I was starting to research all these political parties, it says we believe in the inalienable rights and freedoms of the individual, right? And, what we've had over the last couple of years hasn't been that.
Yeah.
Right? So it's frustrating because that either means that you've now become such a big organization that you no longer espouse those values, or you're just hypocrites.
Yeah.
Right? And neither of those two things are ideal.
Yeah.
Right?
One quick interjection. So I became a citizen a couple of years ago, and one of the things I was asked to sign, I was happy to sign it, was the Declaration for Australian Values. And it talked about the respect for the dignity of the individual and all those things, which I was very happy to sign up to. Those are the values I would want in the society that I call my home. But it's not what we've been living up to in the last couple of years. And in fact, I've got a website I made. It's called stopthisshit.org. Okay, where the very first thing I say is we're not living up to our values. This is what I was asked to sign, and I agree with it. But we as a country have stopped, allowing people to make their individual choices and are forcing authoritarian values on what we felt, what I signed up to as to be a free person.
Yeah.
And to help the people around me be free.
That's right.
And so that to me is, again, at the prerequisite level. I'd love for us to get back to the adult conversations about policy and the pros and cons and life cycle costs and how to best. But we have some back work to do. Yeah. From my point of view.
Yeah. I think it comes down to the individual actually taking more accountability over what control they have.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but you're doing that right now, right? You are one of the people who have stepped up and said, what's happening is not the direction that we should be going. This is not what we signed up to.
Yeah.
And so there are people out there, who are stepping forward to saying, to protest the violation of human rights, to join a political campaign when they didn't actually have any desire in the past. I just want things to be well run.
Yeah.
I don't want, I have lots of interests that I want to pursue.
Yeah.
But right now I think we're at a critical time where, the future of the country as a free people, as a democratic institution that's responsible to its people is from my point of view under threat.
Yep.
And and so I'm very grateful for everyone who stepped forward, who can, and I understand that a lot of people can't, because they've outsourced their trust to a media who is just running a narrative and not a balanced view of the truth. A lot of people don't understand, I think, what, frankly, danger we're in. So that's why at the very first, the prerequisite level, understand that a lot of what you hear is a narrative, and that, if you think that other people are getting propaganda and you're not, you're getting it too.
Yeah.
You just don't realize it.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's that's the prerequisite level is where I think we've got to start. Got to get back to basics. Realizing the rights that people have that have been trod on, and I'm very grateful to people like you who've stepped up and stood up and stand, and trying to point this out.
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, it's not so much like it is about winning the fight, but at the same time, it's the fact that we're having the fight, right? Like I think, and I guess for people to sort of create the visual, right? It's about being the person that sits in the audience and never competes, versus the person that has put it all on the line, win or lose, to fight for what they believe in.
Yeah,
right. And at the end of the day, you may support, you may not support, you may be a fan, you may not be a fan, But at the end of the day, you know, the reason why, you know, we've stepped up to it is not just for our kids, but for your kids too.
Definitely.
Right? So whether you agree or you disagree with us, I still think that, you know, it comes back to that, you know, I've always taken personal responsibility for a lot of the things that have happened in my life. Even things that, you know, people would say, oh, that's got nothing to do with you. But how I respond to it is absolutely within my control.
Yes.
Right? And at the end of the day, you know, I've always, you know, subscribed to the theory that if everybody just decided to not be an asshole, there wouldn't be any assholes in this world. Right? So, you know, power only corrupts the people that want to be corrupted. Yeah. Right? That can be swayed by those values or those, you know, the ideas of those things. So, you know, the better that people are more in tune with who they are as a person. Look, it'd be pretty hard for me to say that anyone is inherently bad, right? I think they're a combination of choices that we make throughout our life, and I think that's also a combination of you know, our surroundings, and also the age that we're brought up in. But you know, to go and say that anybody was born inherently bad would be a very big stretch in my imagination.
You know, I've given a lot of that a bit of thought, and I agree that, you know, even the people who burned others at the stake, I believe thought they were doing God's will, the right thing for, you know, for God and their community. The people who purified the natives and brought Christianity by the sword thought they were doing the right thing. And so, you know, the nature of evil, the nature of you know, authoritarianism, it's not intention in a lot of cases. You know, it may arrogance, perhaps, or you know, just seeing it through the blinders of a narrative. But that's what the Enlightenment was about. In a lot of cases, is recognizing the individual dignity of someone to make their own decisions. And as long as we're holding towards that, you know, there's only so much only so much damage you can do.
True.
You know, the societies that ground millions into the dust were the ones with an authoritarian, totalitarian mindset and actions. And so, you know, that's the big question.
All right, let's start off with this point, right? And I'm going to switch gears again, as I like to do. Let me ask you this. So my brother's 7 years older than me, right? So for me, growing up, I always you know, looked up to him and wanted to be, you know, do the things that he wanted to do, right? And for, like, I always give the example that, you know, when he was 17 and I was 10, you know, I want to do what 17-year-olds do. And he's probably like, you know, he's my annoying little brother. Yeah. So, you know, was it the same for you growing up?
Yeah. You know, I definitely looked up to Pete a lot. You know, being 5 years older than me, he really wanted a younger brother, and he really took care of me throughout my, you know, throughout my childhood and growing up. There was a period where, you know, he sort of moved away. Like, we were playmates for a long time, and then he was interested in girls and, you know, kind of did his own teenage things for a while. But then we came back, you know, at the time of went to university, and but even when he was a bit distant doing his own thing, you know, in the late teens, he always looked after me, and yeah, it's absolutely foundational relationship in my life, and I like to think that he's still with me.
That's it.
And you know, my life, you know, my older son's named Peter, and yeah, it's I was really blessed to have him for the time I did. That's kind of all I can say.
All right, for all the older brothers out there, you know, it's this one for you, okay? So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.